minus 1 minute. T minus 50 seconds. T minus 40 seconds. T minus 30 seconds. T minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good morning and a very warm welcome from sunny Durban to everyone to this, the 28th edition of the Time of the Writer Festival, which is presented by the Center for Creative Arts at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. My name is Lubna Nadvi, and I will be your facilitator for this morning's panel, and what a panel it is, titled Occupation, Power and Persecution. And we have three outstanding writers who are also journalists who will be in conversation with me to talk about their writing, their most recent books, and a whole lot of other things that are currently happening in the world. So without further ado, let me welcome all three of our panelists and welcome to Antony Lewenstein, Azad Essa, and Gavin Evans. It's wonderful to have you with us. Just a quick reminder that the panel will basically be sharing their thoughts, and then the audience will have an opportunity to engage with the panelists and share their questions and any comments that they have on the various platforms that you are watching this session from Facebook and YouTube, and you can pop your questions into the chat boxes to be able to converse with our panelists. So I want to just start off by way of introduction, and let me begin with Antony Lewenstein, who is an independent journalist, author, filmmaker, and co-founder of Declassified Australia, and of course joins us from Australia. His latest book is the global bestseller, The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. And this is also in podcast and film format at the moment. He was based in East Jerusalem from 2016 to 2020, and we look forward to hearing from him regarding his insights, especially around the issue of Palestine. Azad Essa is a South African journalist and writer based in New York currently, and he joins us from there. He works as a senior reporter for the Middle East Eye, focusing on social movements, culture, and resistance, and he is the author of Hostile Homelands, The New Alliance Between India and Israel. And then we are joined by Gavin Evans, who is in, I believe, Port Elizabeth in South Africa. He has served as a journalist in South Africa and the UK. He is the author of several books of nonfiction. He lectures at Birkbeck College, University of London, is a member of the Royal Institution's Challenging Pseudoscience Group, and is the author of White Supremacy, A Brief History of Hatred. So I want to just quickly hold up the books that we will be covering today. And here they are. And at the end of the session, we will then be telling you where we can get the books from. But they're wonderful reading, and I've been enjoying going through them. So let me start off by sort of trying to contextualize the conversation. We know that currently there's a lot happening in the world. And the theme of today's panel, which is focusing on occupation, power, and persecution, is really speaking to the situation on the ground in many parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East and in Palestine and in Gaza. And so I want to start the conversation off by reflecting on what is happening in the region. And I want to bring in Azad in terms of his work and the sort of reflections that he has, and the ideas that he's expressed in his book, Hostile Homelands. A very warm welcome to you, Azad, and wonderful to chat to you again.
Hi, Lubna. Wonderful to see you.
So,
Hi,
yes,
everyone.
so we have had an opportunity to chat about the book before, but I want to extend, the conversation further. And obviously, a lot has happened in Gaza and Palestine, certainly since the 7th of October, 2024. And your work focuses on the idea that there's a kind of India is actually helping Israel advance the occupation. And certainly you make reference to Kashmir and how India is taking the methodology that Israel uses in terms of its occupation back home to India in terms of the Kashmir situation. So please give us an insight into your ideas and your thoughts and sort of some of the core arguments that you're making in this book. Over to you, Azad.
Good morning to everyone in South Africa, and I don't know. I think in Australia it must be afternoon. It's early morning here. Thank you to the Time of the Writer for hosting me and for having this panel. It's extremely important and timely. In terms of your question, Lubna, I think there's so much to unpack, but one of the most important things is that when October 7th took place, India became a major site of disinformation for the Israelis, to express and to amplify, the kind of disinformation that they wanted to, project on that attack, and to make a case for what was going to come next, which was going to be a genocide in Gaza. And so you had, firstly, the Indian Prime Minister being the first, statesman around the world to actually speak about what happened on October 7th. He condemned it. Narendra Modi also called Benjamin Netanyahu to express his condolences. So it's very remarkable that India was the first to do so, right? And that kind of set into motion the Indian media's, response to the story, that this was going to be a topic and a story in which the Indian media was going to take the Israeli side, so to speak. And so what you had was influencers, journalists, pundits, the entire media class, essentially, basically, baying for blood, baying for Palestinian blood. And what you saw immediately was a direct connection between Palestinians and Indian Muslims or Kashmiris, meaning that they were also framed as basically the outsider, and as well as essentially the threat to the nation. And so the basic argument is that if India did not want an incident like October 7th to happen on their soil, they would have to support Israel in this war on the Palestinians. And so you saw this immediate demonization. And what you also saw with that was the Indian government kind of explicitly supporting Israel on the diplomatic front. So when it came to the first call for a ceasefire at the end of October, the Indian government abstained from it. They only kind of begrudgingly supported the next one, which was in December. But after that, you saw, and what has happened since then is that the Indian government has not supported an arms embargo. And so things sort of like, there's an ideological link between the two countries because of the link between the Hindu nationalists and the Zionist ideology, because India is the biggest arms purchaser from Israel. And not just that, they are a huge co-producer of weapons. And as a result, India has become a kind of labor market for the Israelis, as well as a larger buying market for the Israelis and the Israeli military-industrial complex. So much so that by January, 2024, you had reports that India was now sending drones, sending bombs, sending other types of ammunitions to assist in the genocide, basically in Israel's genocide. So you see a direct link between essentially how India responded. It wants to project itself as a strong power. It wants to project itself as an influential player, and it was now actually assisting. So India is not just complicit in this genocide; it's actually aiding it, and through its and if you take a step back, so I mean, when we spoke about this topic, 2 years ago, I think, um, you know, some people were a little bit skeptical about what did we mean about this India-Israel alliance, and somehow in the last year or so, we've seen it sort of unfurl, dramatically, that it's almost impossible to miss.
Thank you for that. And yes, the conversation, a lot has changed on the ground. So I want to now bring in Antony and to reflect on his work that he's sort of focused on in the Palestine Laboratory. It's a very intriguing topic and a very intriguing title, Antony, because clearly what you're saying is that Israel has turned Palestine and the Palestinian territories into a laboratory, experimenting with the use of the latest military technology, killing Palestinians in large numbers, and then, of course, selling the weapons that are used in this genocide, and of course for the last several decades that they've been using, in the book. And yeah, take us through your thinking in this work that you have produced. Thank you. Over to you, Antony. Welcome.
Thank you, Lubna. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for Time of the Writer for inviting me. It is wonderful to be here, even though I'm far away physically, although I know Azad is in New York. So we're in a bit of detail, not too much, into what's been happening in the last, I guess, roughly year and a half since October 7 and how that fits into Israel's broader agenda. So the whole concept of the Palestine Laboratory, although I guess I called it that, I wasn't the first person ever. And essentially it looks at and delves into deeply how Israel has been using the occupied Palestinian territories for decades as a testing ground. And spyware, which are tested first on Palestinians. I'm talking principally about Gaza, the West Bank, also East Jerusalem. In fact, increasingly it's tested on Israeli Jews as well, which is not surprising, as we're seeing in the US, the so-called boomerang effect of US foreign policy, which inevitably always comes home. But what is sort of done out there, so to speak, Latin and South America, Africa, the Middle East, as we're seeing, a lot of Americans might be shocked since Trump has come into office, although it's been happening before Trump came in, is increasingly used on their own people. The sort of methods and violence and surveillance that existed towards other people, non-Americans. And so Israel tests all these weapons and surveillance on Palestinians, and then it's become a key part of Israel's foreign policy. They are selling it for huge profits. In 2023, which is the latest official figures we have, we should get the figures for 2024 soon. And almost certainly they're going to be very, very high. In 2023, it was the largest figures ever. It was water tech, weapons, drones, to a range of countries, democracies and dictatorships. And often I get asked, how many countries has Israel sold it to? The short answer is we don't actually know. We have a rough idea, 130, 140, the majority of nations on the planet, over decades. And I'm talking about this goes, it really in some ways started soon after 1948. It accelerated after 1967 when Israel took control of the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem. And it's really turbocharged since 9/11 and arguably even gone faster since October 7. And one thing I wanted to mention is I recently released a film version of the book, which you can find on YouTube, was made with Al Jazeera. And one of the parts of the book, which we also feature in the film, and in fact, I visited South Africa a few months ago to do this, and I'm sure people listening to this are aware of this, but let me just briefly explain. Israel and South Africa during apartheid were the best of friends, the closest of friends. And like Azad was saying in relation to India and Israel today, They are today ideological soulmates, but also there's a defense relationship. South African apartheid and Israel were remarkably similar. Yes, there were weapons being exchanged, but also both countries during the apartheid era and Israel then, before 1994, and I would argue Israel still today, very much saw themselves in the other. The concept of racial supremacy, the idea that we as Israel, we as South African apartheid, are fighting the black hordes, the Arab hordes. I mean, that's the language that they use. And all was doing in South Africa was partly honing its own methods of repression, and they were inspiring each other. There is lots of examples of elements of the Bantustans appearing in Palestine and vice versa. They're not exactly the same, but they're certainly quite similar. And since October 7, I'll finish on this point. On one level, some people have said to me, well, doesn't October 7 show the laboratory as a complete failure? I mean, literally, Hamas, which is a relatively small guerrilla force, was able to overwhelm a might. The military failed, the government failed, everything was a failure from the Israeli perspective, I mean. And yet here we are 18 months on, and the laboratory has never been stronger or bigger or more powerful. And what I mean by that is that Israel has been testing, for example, huge amounts of innovative artificial intelligence using AI to kill huge amounts of Palestinians. They have used massive amounts of quadcopters, which essentially are killer drones, which are appearing in other contexts around the world. And if you go to some of the arms fairs, that's a good example. There was one recently in the UAE, which has remained very close to Israel during all this process. There are huge Israeli arms companies, government officials promoting weapons, surveillance tech, which has been tested in Palestine on Palestinians in Gaza. It's not even hidden really anymore. So one of the challenges I think that we have as a sane global community, as I would argue fascism is on the rise from the US to parts of Europe and beyond, is that without issues such as an arms embargo or some kind of economic pressure, who publicly oppose Israel's genocide, I'll give an example of Spain, has still been buying and selling weapons in the last 18 months. So I often say to people, look at what a country does, not what it says. Words matter. I'm not denying that, but actions matter more. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Antony. And I picked up this point that you made, that the laboratory is stronger than ever before, because clearly the genocide, is an ongoing project. Although there was a so-called ceasefire for a short period of time, the bombing has resumed in Gaza, and several hundred people in Gaza have been murdered in the last few days, and we see this laboratory in operation. I'd like to now bring in Gavin and to share, his thoughts. And let me just preface this by saying, welcome, Gavin. And a few days ago, the word supremacy and supremacist really became the buzzword all over, particularly South Africa, because Ibrahim Rasool, our former South African ambassador to the United States, used this word supremacist in some comments that he made to a online webinar. And he then gets, if I can use the word, expelled, removed, whatever you want to call it, as the expelled by the United States as the ambassador to the US. And of course, there are multiple views on whether he should have used those words, whether the notion of eugenics and, the scientific aspect of race and racism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts that you share in the book, and tell us a bit more about the supremacy aspect, because everyone really wants to know more. Welcome. Thank you. Over to you, Gavin.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, so what I focus on is the link between the early eugenicists, so Darwin himself, but particularly his cousin Francis Galton, and the kind of alt-right killers of today. And what I've seen, and what the book focuses on in particular, is where these alt-right killers emerge from. People who take assault rifles and gun down people they don't like. So very often Black people, but there've been attacks on Hispanic people, on Sikhs, on Muslims, and on Jews. And so I started delving into the white supremacist ideas that were emerging in a new form, which is sometimes conveniently called the alt-right, alternative right, but the web-based right, and where these ideas were spreading and how they were reaching these killers. And so I looked at some of these message board sites and I went deep into them. In particular, I looked at 4chan, there are others like 8kun and Gab and among others. But I particularly looked at 4chan because it's the biggest of them. And what I found was there was the extreme forms of racism, white supremacist ideas. So there'd been, in the previous couple of decades, ideas percolating in some mainstream circles as well, that white people and Asian people were innately more intelligent than Black people. Now, just a little bit of background on that. The mainstream form that emerged in was the notion that Ashkenazi Jewish people were innately more intelligent than anyone else. And the people punting that in the mainstream were people like Steven Pinker, Andrew Sullivan, the completely bonkers Jordan Peterson, and others. So the people who had big forums were pushing this idea. And of course, it's the cat's paw to the white supremacist idea, because if you say one group is innately more intelligent than others, you're saying implicitly that others are less intelligent, and they left it to others to draw the link. But I found that these people, or some of them, were being quoted on 4chan and were finding their way into the manifestos of these killers. And just to draw a link between the situation in Israel and these white supremacist ideas, very often on these forums, and I went deep into them on like an hour a day I would spend on these forums. Extreme anti-Semitism, including straight Nazi stuff, but yet also support for Israel. And when my world is not contradictory to anti-Semitic ideas, and that too has a long history. So these ideas that some groups are different innately, and that there's a problem that needs to be addressed by eugenic solutions. So the eugenic solutions that have come forward are very similar to those which came forward in the 19th century. One is to halt migration, because the fear is that the genetic pool is being diluted, that kind of idea, and the other white people, that's been phenomenally unsuccessful, because birth rates are declining hugely throughout the Europe, United States, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. So those are and this idea of innate superiority of one group or another has been particularly virulent, exclusively populate these message board sites like 4chan. And there are many reasons for that. They ignored and so on. So they find their ways to these message board sites. And I think even on the more mainstream sites, the algorithms are driving them in a different direction from young women. I mean, I found a strong, it's young men who are maybe attracted by Jordan Peterson, attracted by Andrew Tate, and then go down a rabbit hole and find themselves like Peyton Gendron, who murdered 9 Black people in Buffalo, New York. They find they become full-on white supremacists. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that you're obviously alluding to is this idea of the increase or the sort of move towards the right wing sort of tendencies that we're seeing emerging in different parts of the world. And that's something that I want to explore a bit more. And so I'll come back to Azad now. And, one of the things that all three of you as writers explore in your writings is this within our sort of global politics. And I want to hear your thoughts, Azad, about that in terms of, obviously Israel and India find common ground in terms of the occupations that they maintain, military occupations, particularly in Israel and Kashmir. And what is your sense of this sort of trajectory that, the world is really moving towards a kind of right-wing fascist nationalist space? Is it just something that is there within specific parts of the world, or do you see this happening more broadly and more globally? And then I'll throw that same question to Antony and to Gavin to hear your thoughts. So Azad, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is the question we're all asking. To what extent is this moment going to be replicated and reflected, and to what extent, or to how far, are these right-wing movements and trajectories, going to go? So, I think for me, it's this point about what democracy means, and where does democracy exist, and who gets to call something a democracy. I think the issue starts to some extent there, and we can talk about, for instance, a country like Israel that calls itself like the world's or the only democracy in the Middle East, and you have a country like India that describes itself as the world's largest democracy. And what these terminologies or what these labels give these types of countries is sort of like a license to perform in a particular type of way, to treat its populations in a particular way, and also to escape accountability or international scrutiny. Because when you describe yourself as a democracy, it does not mean essentially that it's just about someone having a chance to vote. You're basically saying that you are a country that's accountable to the people, but you're not really accountable to the people, right? Especially in all three situations. And so that allows essentially allows the state to ensure that other countries don't interfere sort of internally with the country's governance or the way it treats its populations or the people under its control, or the ones being oppressed, right? So what we are facing at this moment is sort of like the extension of right-wing ideologies, often through the using the vocabulary of democracy. Not necessarily saying we are a fascist state, right? But behaving in a very proto-fascist manner, behaving in a way that's pretty much fascist. So you see that in all three countries that I've referenced right now. Because how can a country like Israel or India, even the US, be called even a democracy at all? From the get-go, when you have like Hawaii, under occupation, you have Puerto Rico that's also a US territory that doesn't have the same rights as the rest of the US, where self-determination has been denied. You have the Palestinians living in a concentration camp, as well as under apartheid conditions. You have Kashmiris living as well under occupation. So I think there's a model that's developing to some extent in which I think other countries are going to look into that, as well as borrow from that and borrow the lingo and essentially escape scrutiny themselves. And when you think about a country like India and Israel and the US, there's also this idea of it spreading democracy. But but it's actually spreading a very specific type of way of governance. So Israel, as you know, Anthony has written also intensely about this, is that it's about when you sell a weapon, when Israel sells a weapon, it's not selling something that you just point and shoot. You're selling a methodology of dealing with people. And so India now is a partner to that methodology, right? And the US is the sponsor, the overarching authority that looks after that, that methodology. And you have other countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and others, right, that are able to, latch on to that because of so many other things like the so-called war on terror, in which you're able to demonize the entire Muslim body across the world, and so you are able to get away with certain kind of exceptions as a democracy, right? So I mean, I don't know if that answers your question fully, but we are in a remarkable moment in terms of it's very clear that people's rights are being stripped away very, very fast, and people are a little bit, or many parts of the left in many of these countries are kind of are failing to understand how to react because of the neoliberal economy that's also stripped away traditional forms of protest in terms of like the labor movements, and also in terms of free speech in these countries as well. So like in India, you have the farmers' movements that's very strong, that's pro-BDS, huge trade unions that are also talking about Israel and talking about boycotting Israel, for instance. But so many of them are stripped out of the formal economy now because of the big billionaire class, right? And so for instance, right, I'll give you a very small example. In the first few months of the genocide, you had Indian unions talking about not offloading weapons from ships, right? Or actually loading weapons as well. It was a very armament port, and which is allowed sort of like.
For explaining that, and for those of us and human rights are sort of institutionalized and remain strong, it's a huge concern for us. So let me take that question now to Anthony, and in terms of the sort of shift, this change, the stripping away of rights. Over to you. Thank you.
I mean, that currently has a sort of centre-left-ish government. I'm hedging because on some issues they're not particularly left at all. On other issues they kind of are, and there's going to be an election here within the next couple of months. So I guess we'll know more about what the Australian people want moving forward. I think Trump in some ways is helping the current government maybe stay in power, because a lot of people look at the more so-called conservative forces aligning themselves with Trump, and they frankly are appalled by that. They're appalled by what's happening in the US on a multitude of issues. Look, in terms of and Azad touched on this in his talk, that one of the things that Israel has done for a long time, and again, this was long before October 7, is to provide a model for many other countries to follow. It's not that other countries want to become Jewish states. I don't mean it like that. But the affinity between, for example, Israel and India that Assad has written about so well over the years, as we say, is not just a defense relationship, it's an ideological relationship. It's a belief in ethno-nationalism. It's a belief that in this worldview, India has the right to be a Hindu fundamentalist state, and if you're non-Hindu, namely Muslim or others, you'll be discriminated against, maybe kicked out. Just if you're not Jewish in Israel, you are a second-class citizen. I mean, it's been codified in the law, for Christ's sake, right? If you're a Palestinian living in Gaza, you're potentially going to be murdered or droned, as has happened extensively in the last 18 months, and frankly, in the last close to 20 years since Israel imposed a blockade in around 2007. So one of the so-called models that worries me, that I see a lot of people talking about, and I note that Gavin mentioned this in his talk, that it is strange for some people to see how many elements Israel on a range of issues. One, they see Israel as being proudly chauvinist. They see Israel as being proudly racist, obviously against non-Jews. They see Israel as being deeply antagonistic towards multiculturalism, towards Muslims. And there's a reason why, literally, that term loosely, so-called anti-Semitism. And who are the major guests? Some of Europe's most strongly anti-Semitic political leaders coming from countries. And in some ways, it makes a lot of sense that the growing alliance between Israel and the global alliance, I'm generalizing here, but in general, more and more so-called liberal Jews are turning away from Israel. I'm not saying all, it's obviously a complicated picture, but in general, if you look at the polling in the US, liberal Jews are increasingly disillusioned with Israel, particularly young Jews. So therefore, Israel is looking for friends. And where are they finding that? Evangelicals, the US and elsewhere, the global far right. And there is seemingly no hesitation, at least amongst many within the Israeli political elites and in much of the public, not all, but most, to align themselves with political forces that traditionally have not just hated Jews, but have literally killed them or wanted to. And as someone who is Jewish myself, although I'm not religious at all, I'm atheist or non-religious, it is an utter betrayal of our own history to have a Jewish state, self-described, partnering and inspiring global fascist far-right forces who are in the ascendancy. Trump being the obvious example, but it's also across Europe, France to Germany to Sweden to Holland. Some are in power and some are not. Some might be in power in the coming years. And that alliance is deeply, deeply dangerous because many of those nations are looking to how Israel is treating the Palestinians and wanting a piece of that in their own country. We go back to the laboratory again. So many of these countries in Europe, for example, are buying so-called border tech that Israel uses to essentially fortify itself and has created a ghetto state in the Middle East. They're using that to keep out brown and black bodies, essentially, mostly Muslims, but also black Africans. And as I show in my book, and it's in the film, Europe, for example, increasingly is using Israeli border tech on the US-Mexico border. Across the border, mostly in Arizona, there's huge amounts of surveillance towers produced by Elbit, Israel's leading defense company. So you see the export of the occupation in Palestine. The occupation of Palestine is not staying there. And the danger to that is that I see a Palestinianization of many parts of the world. Whereas, I mean, the world has always been ghettoized to an extent. I don't want to idealize the past by any means. For many people in the world, there has never been a so-called liberated existence. I'm very well aware of that. But more and more countries see how Israel's treating Palestinians and getting away with it and want a piece of it themselves in their own country. Democracies and dictatorships.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you make an important point about how some countries are looking to, import this notion of we got to this point. So I want to come to Gavin, who's kind of really, explored the scientific component of this and really, help us to understand this shift. And can we actually, is there pushback? Can we actually come back from where we are, and to help us to see where we are at the moment? Over to you, Gavin. Thank you.
Yeah, we can always come back from places because we can always people can always change. Just to go back to the beginning of the question, there's a popular myth that history repeats itself, and I think it's a lazy myth because it doesn't. Each historical era is unique, and we have to learn from and analyze what forces are in the historical moment we are in and where they come from, and those are always going to be different. And if we draw just from history repeats itself, let's do what we did then, we're going to be coming up with the wrong strategy. So that's just a general point. But so what is unique about the current moment that takes us in the direction of fascism. And I think that what we've seen in many countries of the world are the election of populist right-wing governments. So we saw that in Europe, particularly in Hungary, other places as well. We've seen that in India. We've seen it in Turkey. We saw that in Brazil. It was reversed when Lula won. And of course, we've seen that in the United States. Now, the scope of democracy. So first of all, let's restrict the generally. You can see that most particularly in Turkey, but we can see in the United States that's happening as well. Look at what Jeff Bezos is doing with the Washington Post as an example. And they use a kind of pressure that makes the institutions of civil society feel like they have to retreat. So the scope for expressing other views it becomes much more limited, and that's a key component of democracy. And so what emerges is something close to elected dictatorships in these countries. So that's the one side of things, and it's being led by populists who are right wing in the sense that they are headed by people who are dictatorial figures. They are they don't believe in the free press. They have very conservative ideas about women and about gay people and so on. And they create enemies, whether it's liberals or whoever it is, whichever country they're in. And those are often ethnic enemies as well. Palestinians in Israel, for example. Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians in India, for example. So that's one element. But there's another element taking place, which is it was more subterranean, but it's no longer that. And that is what's happening in social media, where right-wing ideas and right-wing platforms have proliferated. And they're proliferated in particular, as I mentioned before, among young white men, but not only white men, because some of those ideas have spread much more widely into countries that are not predominantly white, but particularly white men, and ideas that link up with the fantasies or with the views of these populist leaders. So there's extreme anti-feminism and extreme sexism, ideas of that men need to be real men, so that they need to build up their muscles, things like that. And those are often then the shift from those to the views that white people and white men are having a bad deal, and that they need to unite together, and that they need to elect leaders like Trump. They're very closely of their interests. So they drive in a way that's never really happened before over the last less than 10 years, 5 years, driving Gen Z women in one direction and Gen Z men in another direction. And it was most remarkable I thought, in the Trump election, where the gap between what young white men were voting for the fascist AfD party, and that is really a fascist party, the young women, young German women, were voting in large numbers for the party of the left. So there's this happening in AI, what's happening with the algorithms that direct the kind of traffic that people get online. So I think those two things are happening simultaneously, and they each rub off against each other. And it's a very dangerous moment, I think, in history, because we see democracy in all sorts of ways being curtailed, and we see particular views proliferating and alternative views being pushed under the carpet. So I think that's the kind of climate we internationally at the moment. And obviously it's worrying. As to your question, of course it can be challenged. I mean, if it couldn't be challenged, I don't think any of us would have been writing the books that we've written. And of course, one doesn't have the arrogance to say that a book's going to have a huge effect. But sometimes when people read books who have more access to, for example, social media, those ideas can percolate. So ideas always need to be challenged. I mean, if we're going to give up and say, well, these guys are winning, this is the new world we're living in, what can we do about it? Is defeat. And so we need to continue fighting, and words can be potent weapons.
Thank you for that, Gavin. It's very encouraging to know that we can actually come back from the sort of edge. Obviously, we've known throughout history that major sort of empires have risen and fallen. And so, here we are in this moment where this movement of extremism and fascism is sort of on the rise, but we have to make sure that its sort of growth is stopped and come back from the edge. So I want to then just pick up on some of those ideas because I want to then focus on this notion of persecution because clearly people trying to actually resist against fascism, trying to resist against the sort of stripping away of rights, as Azad spoke about, and trying to challenge this notion of the laboratory that, Antony speaks about. Obviously, people be arrested. They're going to face all kinds of, challenges. And I mean, we're in the last 10 minutes of our conversation, but I wanted to just give each of you an opportunity to reflect on this notion of how, this persecution is unfolding and what are some of the ways that we can actually counter it. And also, as writers, you are speaking truth to power. You're taking on, the sort of the power and the sort of the military establishments and the military industrial complex. Have you faced persecution yourself, and in what form has it sort of manifested itself? So just in sort of a minute or two to reflect on this notion of persecution and where we are on that. Azad, I'll sort of throw it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lubna. Look, this is a tough question because there's no way I think any of us can discuss being persecuted as compared to what's happening to the Palestinians right now, whether you are a writer or not. The Israelis have systematically annihilated journalists in Gaza. And they have assassinated several other journalists in the West Bank as well. So that level of persecution, I mean, is it's on a completely different level, right? The Indian state as well also uses the so-called anti-terror laws as well to criminalize civil society and journalists as well, where you have several journalists and activists sitting in jail with no charges actually being leveled against them, just on just being slapped with sort of a terrorism accusation and waiting for the state to actually make its claim on why they are in jail, right? So these are the sort of proto-fascist kind of methods that these states are using. In the U.S., you might be watching how things are unfolding very fast here, in which every day you have a scholar, who's either denied entry into the U.S. or deported. You have Mahmoud Khalil, a student activist, who's basically picked up outside his apartment block. Even the green card, right? That's led to a precedent in which you can be a permanent resident and you can be targeted for taking part in pro-Palestine protests, and kind of there's a type of very petty and and disgusting type of punitive measures being imposed or exercised on certain people's rights based on other issues that are taking place, right? So, for instance, Columbia University, even though it's been very harsh on its students, the state has deemed that it's not been strong enough, right, on pro-Palestine protests, and so they started removing funds, federal funds from the university, almost $400 million or so. And as a result, you see things like Mahmoud Khalil, who studied at Columbia, kind of becoming like a bargaining chip with the state, and you see also the university expelling and revoking degrees. When do you revoke a degree? When does university revoke a degree? It's either like if it's plagiarism, or if a person's like a serial killer or something really dramatic in terms of a crime. But yeah, you're talking about someone expressing their viewpoint about opposing a genocide, and they are being, they are losing, they're losing their careers, right? So, there's, of course, there are dangers in writing about this. Of course, there are struggles. Often, I'm attacked online, and there are other kinds of things like that. But there's nothing to with. However, that's not to say that there are different levels to this, and that the way the U.S. and the way other countries deal with people sort of abroad and other places are not going to take place over here, because they already started. And so it very much depends on your skin color, and sort of maybe your religion, or the kind of words that you use, or the kind of example that the state wants to make with regards to where you fit into the pecking order, if you're going to be targeted or not. So there is a kind of arbitrariness to it as well, which makes it even more frightening. But yeah, we are in a situation in which it is becoming more difficult to be a writer, and in an economy that has made so many writers, freelancers, without any protections from any company or any kind of overarching media house. So no one's in charge of you, no one's protecting you, essentially. So there's a lot of things happening at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you, Azad. Antony, your thoughts?
I'll just keep my thoughts brief, because I know we have to wrap up in a minute. Look, I also, with Azad, I agree. It sort of almost feels inappropriate to talk about any potential threats against us as individuals. I don't want to speak for the other two speakers, of course, but I mean, look, as someone Jewish who's critical of Israel, I've been getting hate mail for decades, but it's something you sadly get used to, and it becomes sadly quite normal. It's often coming from other Jews, but to be honest, in general, it is incomparable to what so many other people are going through. Obviously, I'm thinking particularly about Palestinians in Gaza. I'm thinking about the fact that Palestinian journalists have been killed in unprecedented numbers in Gaza in the last 18 months, more so than any other conflict in modern times. Hundreds of journalists, everyone from videographers to written journalists to YouTubers, a range of people. And I think one of the things that's increasingly happening in remarkable speed is that within 2 months of Trump being elected in the US, and it's pretty clear on some areas where he is taking his country, namely towards a deeply authoritarian, in the short term, that's clearly where America is and where it's going to go. Many, many people around the world fundamentally and utterly, but there are also huge numbers of people around the world who look to America just with horror. And what's so ironic is that America's actions is actually making its ability to, I would argue, remain the world's only superpower almost impossible. America has massive power. That's not going to change tomorrow or next week. That'll remain. But we're in a multipolar world. The days of America being the sole superpower, it's over. I mean, it was over long before Trump. It's over. And for many, many people around the world, they look to America's actions and its intolerance, its racism, with disgust, and they do not want to follow the American path. And the challenge finally is nations that have far too closely hitched themselves to the US, including a nation like mine, Australia, and others, frankly, are going to have to find a more independent path, because Washington is not our future. The end.
Washington is not our future. Thank you. That's quite a powerful statement. Gavin, over to you. And before you come in, Gavin, I just want to remind the audience that you're welcome to type any questions that you have in the chat boxes on the platforms that you're watching this from. And there'll be a few minutes just to quickly answer questions. But if there are no questions, we'll give the panelists an opportunity just to wrap up on their thoughts. Over to you, Gavin.
Yeah, so others have touched on the forms of persecution that exist in the world. So I don't want to go at that, but I just want to look at one example of that, which is a bit off the topic of my book. But it's the way that states can define narratives. And I think this is particularly the case with respect to Zionism. Partly because of the Labour Party's recent history, Keir Starmer and those under him have defined a narrative which was set by really the Israeli state, which was that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Now, for those of us who don't believe that, and there were many in the Labour Party who didn't believe that, I left the Labour Party partly for that reason. Find it impossible to get the ideas forward within the context of a political party, but within the context of the media more generally, except for the kind of left fringe of it. And that becomes more and more difficult because Israel had been or was very successful in defining that narrative. Now, I think it's been challenged by just what's happening in Gaza and the kinds of things that Antony was referring to, where young people in America are just not buying that narrative anymore. But it remains a very powerful narrative, which is influencing what's happening in say, Columbia University. It influences the way the press deals with the issue and so on. And it's a very significant example of how a state can define a narrative that makes it very difficult for people to operate outside of that narrative, even though they know that narrative is false. So that's one aspect of that. Another aspect is how things shift. So for a long time, at least over the last 2 years, there were many people who felt that America was on the side of Israel, and they were on the side of the Palestinians, and that's certainly my own view. But turned around as well, Putin, which makes people have to think again on that narrative. But I think the more general point I'm making is that when these defining narratives come and people are being persecuted in one way or another for going against that narrative, is that we'd like to see, and I think that's part of the persecution that we're seeing, is the suppression of ideas.
Thank you. And yes, the suppression of ideas is something that's an ongoing challenge. And we, of course, have to rage against it and fight against it, because we need to make sure that we, of course, as you know, the saying goes, may 1,000 flowers bloom, may there be many ideas, but of course you want the right ideas. You want the ideas that are going to come in from the audience that is watching this. So I'm going to give each of you a minute, please, to just tell us a bit more about where people can get hold of your writing and how they can engage further with your work on other multiple platforms that you're on, other forms that your writing has taken. So please, if you can keep it to a minute or less, thank you so much. Back to you, Azad.
Yeah, I think at this moment, I feel as if like it is an opportunity for us to learn more about other struggles and how things are connected. If we are going to address things like this, we have to understand the structural connections between things. We can't just be very like myopic and focus only on the things that affect us, because ultimately they will come for us too, and so we have to look at these connections, and that's why in my mind I've tried to look at the topic like India and Israel, because it was not a topic that seemed to be on people's minds in terms of there's this idea of India and there's actually a reality, completely different reality, and that is shaping our world as the US sort of dismantles in a way. There's this other power that's developing and taking over in some ways, including universities, right? They work a lot with Israeli universities, but that's all I would say. If as well as I'm a Middle East eye, you can find a lot of my stuff there. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for joining us, Azad. Antony.
I would also say that we're at such a precarious moment, and inevitably the attacks on people that are occurring in the US, as I'd said, there's a range of academics and pro-Palestine activists and others who are being ostracized, kicked out of the country, threatened, etc. We're not far away, in my view, from the possibility of the US exploring ways to try to expel US citizens, which, by the way, Israel's been trying to do for years. Not particularly successfully, I might add, although for Palestinians, very much so. If you want to find more of my work, I'm easily found for my sins, and my work appears on many platforms. And for those who want to read my book, it's available in many countries now, the Palestine Laboratory in English and many other languages. And if people want to listen to the podcast, it came out late last year with Drop Site News, which is a US media outlet. And the film is a 2-part series on Al Jazeera. Just put that into YouTube. It's free. You should watch it. It's great. And I want to thank everyone for inviting me and giving us the time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antony, for joining us and for your thoughts today. And Gavin, take it away.
Okay, just one thing I wanted to stress about opposing all this is that the way to look at it is not to look at it individually, not to look at this idea, that idea makes me feel unsafe or hurts me or whatever, but rather to think more of what I have in common with other people, even if I have differences with them. In other words, a kind of, if we did learn from history, it would be the united front approach, where even if we disagree on point A, B, and C, but we agree on point D, then let's all unite on point D, so that you can find allies with people who you fundamentally disagree with and whose ideas you find hurtful. But on specific campaigns, at least, we can find allies, and we'll be much more effective than focusing on the little things that divide us, or even the big things that divide us. So that's a general point that I wanted to make. Just where I can be found, well, my latest book, White Supremacy, A Brief History of Hatred, is published by Jonathan Ball in South Africa, and under the title White Supremacy From Eugenics to the Great Replacement is published, it's the same book, is published by Icon in the United Kingdom. And otherwise I can be found on, I'm still on X at GMR Evans, and more so on other platforms like Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, and Insta. So all my stuff now and then comes out on those platforms, partly because my publishers would not be happy with me if it didn't.
Thank you so much, Gavin. So let me conclude this session by thanking our panelists for their amazing insights, and I highly recommend their books. Please grab yourselves a copy or try to engage with their works and writings online. I want to thank our technical assistants for support for the session. And of course, the 28th edition of The Time of the Writer is hosted by the Center for Creative Arts. We want to thank our sponsors, and it's made possible with support from the National Arts Council of Organization. So we to still be happening at the Time of the Writer right until Sunday. So please make sure that you go online to the Time of the Writer Facebook page to find out what's still going to unfold. It's happening till the weekend, and we look forward to having you join us, whether it's in person or online. Once again, thank you so much to our amazing panelists. It's been wonderful to have this conversation with you, and we will end it there. Thank you so much.